Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. As an additional trigger warning, this episode is about racism, misogyny, and rape in the 1940s and 50s, and some archaic and offensive language will be quoted. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Before the Civil War and the end of slavery, many Southern states had an unwritten law known as paramour rights. Paramour rights referred to the God-given right of a white man to rape a black woman, force her to have his children, and not take any responsibility as either the rapist or the father. When slavery ended in the Southern United States, paramour rights did not. Although paramour rights were never officially legalized, they were accepted by the general public and enabled by Jim Crow laws, which allowed racism and miscegenation, especially in Florida. For almost 100 years after slavery ended, there was an unspoken understanding among Florida law enforcement, court officials, and politicians. White men could rape black women and face no consequences. This made black women a target. If a white man wanted to commit violence, he need only choose a black woman to get away with it. And if the result of that violence was a child, well, it certainly wasn't the white man's problem. This may seem far off to you: ancient history, slavery, Jim Crow laws, racism. But it wasn't. It was barely a lifetime ago. There are people alive today who remember the United States before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These people are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, but they remember. Loretta McCollum certainly remembered. She passed away just a few years ago. But before that, she was born in 1945 to Ruby McCollum, a black woman. Ruby was raped by a white politician named Dr. Clifford Leroy Adams, Jr. She never reported Adams for rape. She couldn't. He was protected by paramour rights, white supremacy, and a corrupt court system. When Ruby took matters into her own hands, it was hard to blame her for it. Welcome to episode 179, The Silencing of Ruby McCollum. Ruby Myrtle Jackson was born on August 31st, 1909 in Zuber, Florida, to her father William and mother Gertrude. She grew up 1 mile south of Zuber in an unincorporated community known as Kendrick. Ruby was the second oldest child out of 6. She had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. Ruby, her 5 siblings, and her parents lived in a modest country home. It had 4 bedrooms, which was small for their large family, but the Jackson family made do. Ruby's parents were farmers, and the family spent a lot of time working on the farm. They mostly raised cattle. At one point, they had as many as 60 heads of cattle, until a Florida no-fence law forced the Jacksons to drastically reduce their herd. In addition to cattle, the Jacksons grew other crops for themselves and their neighbors, things like peanuts, corn, and rice. When they weren't helping with the farm, Ruby and her siblings climbed the big oak tree in their yard. They played old English games like London Bridge is Falling Down and Heavy, Heavy Hangs Overhead. But the Jackson kids couldn't play some games they saw other children playing. They weren't allowed. Because Ruby's family was deeply religious. Her father was a steward in the African Methodist Church. Her mother was the Sunday school superintendent. The Jackson family's religious beliefs prohibited them from dancing, gambling, and any other activity that could hinder their spiritual growth. And that meant no dominoes, no checkers, and no playing cards. The Jacksons were strict about their religion. In addition to banning certain games, William and Gertrude made sure their children memorized the Sunday school lessons well before Sunday. And Ruby's stern parents would not let their kids play with other children. If Ruby's mother, Gertrude, caught one of the kids hanging out with another classmate or friend, she would beat them with a firm hand. But on occasion, the Jackson children decided the reward of playing with their friends was worth the wrath of Gertrude. And when that happened, Ruby was known for taking her beatings with fewer tears and wails than any of her brothers and sisters. She would endure in silence. Strangely enough, enduring in silence would become a lifelong theme for Ruby. All her life, Ruby was a quiet person. Some referred to her as self-contained. If she was feeling a strong emotion, happy, sad, or otherwise, you wouldn't know it just by looking at her. For a person whose religion stopped her from playing poker, she had a great poker face. But despite her reserved demeanor, Ruby was known to have fun. As a child, she was a tomboy. She often roughhoused with her siblings, played marbles, and won at sports like yard ball. But Ruby's tomboy tendencies lessened as she entered her adolescence. Then she became an avid reader. She devoured romance novel after romance novel. Over time, Ruby began to realize her femininity, and she decided she liked it. She noticed that both boys and men looked at her small frame differently. The principal of Ruby's high school said she was a very pretty girl, but seemed unaware of it. But Ruby said she was very much aware of the attention men gave her for her looks. She liked it. But Ruby was quick to say she wasn't ruled by it. Her main goal was to be a good student and a devout Christian, and young Ruby was successful at both. As a teenager, she was extremely active in her church. She was a delegate for Sunday school conventions and district conferences. And as a student, Ruby also excelled. She attended a high school called Fessenden Academy. It was a private school for Black youths. Ruby's family couldn't afford Fessenden's expensive tuition. So instead of money, Ruby's parents gave the academy beef in exchange for their 6 children's tuition. While going to Fessenden Academy, Ruby was approached by her first male suitor. Those who knew Ruby weren't surprised that she had caught a man's attention. She was an attractive 17-year-old young woman, known for being soft-spoken, sweet, and surprisingly funny. The man requested Ruby's hand in marriage, but she said no. She thought he didn't have enough ambition or intelligence to be her husband. Ruby later said, "I could not see myself loving a man who could see 10 things and not even understand one. I wanted a man who could see one thing and understand 10. Ruby graduated from Fessenden in 1929 when she was 18 years old. While there, she developed an interest in both nursing and teaching. She tried her hand at teaching for 1 year after the academy, but it didn't work out. Ruby never had the opportunity to become a nurse, but she thought she would have liked it. By her own description, she was always the responsible, motherly type, perfect for a caretaker role like nursing. In 1931, 22-year-old Ruby married a local man she had known most of her life, 34-year-old Samuel McCollum. He went by Sam. Sam was not the same man who proposed to Ruby when she was 17. Ruby liked Sam much more than the first guy, and for good reason. She wanted someone ambitious and intelligent, and Sam was both of those things. Plus, he was a good provider and a strong man. He was a carpenter by trade, so he knew how to work with his hands, and Sam always had a new money-making idea. On March 10th, 1931, Ruby and Sam had a small wedding. This was the Great Depression after all. Only their families were invited. That night, the couple left for New York City. But they weren't going on a honeymoon like you might think. They were moving to the Big Apple to try to find good jobs, and they weren't alone. From 1910 to 1970, millions of Black people moved from the southern United States to the northern Midwestern and Western states. Today, historians refer to this mass exodus as the Great Migration. Black people wanted better employment opportunities and less racism. Cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and New York City were portrayed as racism-free utopias for Southern Black Americans. Remember, this was still decades before the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. At this time, the Southern United States had a rocky relationship with Black people, and rocky is putting it kindly. We're talking loud and proud racism, violence against people of color, and shameless white supremacy. Florida, where Ruby lived, was a hotbed for racism. Jim Crow laws were in their heyday, meaning, among other things, there were well-funded white schools, and then there were the poorly funded black schools. And the segregation didn't stop there. Streetcars, railroads, waiting rooms, restaurants, and more were divided into white and black sections. Interracial marriage was illegal. Even interracial roommates were illegal. Voter suppression tactics, like poll taxes and literacy tests, made it nearly impossible for Black people to vote. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It made sense that Ruby and Sam wanted to escape Florida for a better future. Unfortunately, Ruby and Sam found that the North was not much better than the South. Many other Black people who made this great migration came to the same conclusion. Although individual racism was improved in the North, as in fewer white people were just spouting off the N-word, there were still widespread issues. Racially charged housing discrimination, wealth disparity, and redlining, just to name a few. After several years of living in New York, Ruby and Sam called it quits. They made the long trek back to Florida, this time with a new member of their family in tow, their son, Little Sam Jr. After living in Fort Myers for a spell, Ruby, Sam, and Sam Jr. moved to a farming town in North Florida called Live Oak. Located in Suwannee County, Live Oak was home to about 4,000 people. It was your typical small town. Everyone knew everyone. In Live Oak, Ruby's husband Sam began 2 new business ventures. Both were very lucrative, but also very illegal. First, there was his moonshine business. In the 1940s, Live Oak was in a dry county, so residents jumped at the opportunity to buy Sam's under-the-table liquor. The second business was running a gambling operation. He specialized in a Cuban game called bullied. I hadn't heard of bullied before, so in case you're like me and don't know what it is, I'll explain. Bullied is a low-stakes lottery game. In the early to mid-1900s, it was really popular in Florida, especially among working-class minority groups. There are many variations of bullied, but here's the simplest version. 100 numbered balls are placed in a bag and mixed up. Then bets are placed as to which numbered ball will be drawn from the bag. Usually the bets are smaller. You'd put a nickel on number 4 or a dime on number 82, that kind of thing. The balls themselves remind me of bingo or ping pong balls. They're small and white. The word bolita translates to little ball in Spanish. Florida crime organizations love to run bolita games for one reason. It was easily rigged. The person running the game could fill some balls with lead so they would sink to the bottom. They could put more balls on a specific number in the bag. They could even freeze certain balls so they were cold to the touch when they reached in to draw one out. The profit margin for bolita games was already big, and it was made bigger by these corrupt game organizers. But the general public didn't seem to care. Bolita was fun, and it was cheap and easy to play. And despite being outlawed, it was easy to find. Although Sam's liquor business was profitable, he was more widely known for his gambling operation. Locals dubbed him Bolita Sam, and everyone played his bolita games. From poor Black folks to well-off white people, everyone's name was somewhere in Sam's ledger. Ruby, who was still very much a godly woman, didn't seem to mind that Sam had several illegal businesses. If I had to guess, Ruby probably gave Sam a pass for 3 reasons. Number 1, the law wasn't known for doing Black people, and especially not Black women, any favors. Number 2, the 1940s wasn't a time where women could speak against their husbands. And number 3, Sam was making a lot of money. The Depression was over. America had been in 2 wars, and folks had money burning holes in their pockets after so many lean years. What was wrong with wanting to have some fun? After a decade of consistent business, Sam was the bolita king of Suwannee County. And this made Sam the richest man in the area. And not just the richest Black man. He was richer than everyone, Black or white, for 700 square miles, which made Ruby the richest woman. So yeah, Ruby probably didn't mind that Sam broke a few laws. And after Sam had so much success with his illegal businesses, he was able to participate in a few legal ones. He would eventually purchase a 900-acre tobacco farm. He invested in several rental properties, and he was a primary stakeholder in a Black-owned life insurance company. Journalists reported that Sam was the leading Black businessman, farmer, and citizen in Live Oak. They estimated that he and Ruby were worth about $500,000, over $6 million in today's money. As you might imagine, Ruby and Sam lived a fairly lavish lifestyle. After all, they could afford it. The Pittsburgh Courier wrote that the McCollums lived in the finest house in Live Oak. Their yellow stucco house had 9 bedrooms, palm trees in the front yard, and trendy Venetian blinds. Sam and Ruby owned a TV, which was a pricey piece of equipment at this time. It probably ran them about $100, $1,500 in today's money. For Ruby and Sam, that was pocket change. Ruby was known for having several $100s in her purse at all times, and Sam always bought her the newest, nicest cars. The McCollums never had to worry about their bills. They paid them on time and without question. They were known for it. Needless to say, Ruby and Sam were doing really well. Financially, they had no worries, and emotionally, they also seemed to be thriving. Sam's sister said the McCollums were happy and in love. By October of 1945, 36-year-old Ruby was a housewife. She and Sam had 2 children, 12-year-old Sam Jr. and 3-year-old Kay Myrna. And Ruby was about to give birth to their next child, a little girl named Sonia Celine. In preparation for Sonia, Ruby did what most expecting mothers do. She saw a doctor. And that doctor was Clifford Leroy Adams Jr. Dr. Adams was the most prominent white man in Suwannee County. Besides being a medical doctor, he was also a business associate of Ruby's husband, Sam. While it was never proven in any official way, Live Oak residents knew that Dr. Adams helped Sam bribe local authorities to look the other way during Sam's bullied games. As in, Sam would pay Dr. Adams, who would then pay the police. This was supported by Adams's employees at the doctor's office. They saw Adams accept large deliveries of cash in his examination room. It's not clear why Sam couldn't pay the police himself, skipping Dr. Adams as the middleman, but probably because he was Black and the police were almost certainly white. And Dr. Adams had a reputation for being kind to Black people, so it's not a surprise that he was working with Sam. In fact, Dr. Adams was the only doctor in the entirety of Suwannee County who would even treat Black patients. Which brings us full circle. Ruby, a Black woman, was pregnant. She needed a doctor, and Dr. Adams, a well-liked white man, and her husband's business associate, was her best available option. So Adams helped Ruby give birth to her 3rd child, Sonia. 3 months later, Ruby called the doctor. She explained to him that she wasn't feeling well, and she was concerned. She hadn't felt this poorly after the birth of her first 2 children. Was something wrong? Ruby was scared that she was dying, and that her children would grow up motherless. But fortunately, Dr. Adams was willing to help, for a price. Obviously, he didn't want money because money wasn't a problem for Ruby McCollum. Clifford Leroy Adams Jr. was born into a rich and influential family in 1908 in Jasper, Florida. His grandfather, Frank Adams, was the founder of Florida's Barnett Banks and president of the Florida State Senate. But besides that, not much information is available about Adams's childhood. Adams grew into a tall man. A Pittsburgh Courier journalist wrote with flowery admiration that Adams was a broad-shouldered 6-footer with magnificence of body and an irresistible smile. Adams was handsome and had no problem charming women, and in 1928, 20-year-old Clifford Adams Jr. charmed and married a 19-year-old teacher named Florrie Jernigan. Together, they had 2 children, a daughter named Laverne and their son, Clifford III. Adams and his family set up shop in Live Oak. There, his medical practice flourished. After years of service, Dr. Adams was beloved by the community. And not just the white community. Black people liked him too. In addition to being the only doctor who would treat Black patients, Adams was known for being friendly to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin. And he was generous. He would often give people medical care for free. There were rumors that Dr. Adams didn't really need the money from his medical practice. He was independently wealthy from his purebred swan farms. Plus, Adams had whatever income he was making from helping Sam with his Bolita operation, so he was quick to waive off the occasional medical bill. And he was beginning a new line of work, politics. He ran for the Florida State Senate. His campaign supported no new taxes, free medical care for the elderly, reduced land taxes, better public education, opening a new medical school, and increased racetrack taxes. That's a pretty damn good platform in any race. And in August of 1952, Dr. Adams won. Those close to Adams explained that he wouldn't settle for senator for long. Someday, Dr. Adams wanted to be Florida's governor. Right after he was an elected senator, Ruby stopped by his office. It was about 10 a.m. on Sunday, August 3rd. By this point, baby Sonia, who Adams helped deliver, wasn't a baby anymore. She was almost 7 years old, and Ruby had a new baby daughter, 1-year-old Loretta, who was Ruby's 4th child. Even though Ruby needed to go to the doctor, she didn't have a babysitter to watch Sonia and Loretta, and her husband Sam was at church that Sunday morning. Ruby was known to skip church, preferring to worship on her own terms. So Ruby took the 2 little girls with her to Dr. Adams's office. They waited in the back seat of Ruby's brand new 1951 two-tone blue Chrysler while Ruby went inside. Ruby thought this would be a quick visit with Dr. Adams, and technically I guess it was. She was going to see him because her shoulder had been hurting her. After sitting in the segregated waiting room, Ruby went back into the examination room with Dr. Adams. He gave her 3 shots of penicillin. Afterward, he charged her $9, and Ruby paid him in cash. But then Dr. Adams brought up a concern. There was an additional unpaid medical bill that Ruby owed, a much more expensive bill for $116. That's just over $1,000 in today's money. Not enough to bankrupt some people, but definitely a shock to hear about if you weren't expecting it. Dr. Adams explained that the bill was mailed to Sam, but Adams hadn't received payment yet. He was adamant that Ruby needed to pay him right there, right then. She was outraged. She wasn't expecting this bill, and she certainly didn't think she had to pay it right that second. But Dr. Adams was insistent. Ruby needed to reimburse him for his services. Still, Ruby argued. Frustrated, Dr. Adams turned away from her. He said, "Woman, I'm tired of fooling with you." And as soon as Dr. Adams turned his back to Ruby, she saw her chance. She pulled out a nickel-plated Smith & Wesson and shot him several times in the back. He immediately fell to the floor dead. Okay, let's pause for a moment. Does that sound right to you? That a doctor who was known for excusing expensive medical bills would insist that his patient had to pay him right then and there? Or that Ruby McCollum, a rich woman who was known for paying her bills on time, wouldn't be able to pay her bill? That she would be so infuriated by this bill that she would kill a man? Ruby was a reserved woman. Locals referred to her as the quietest woman in town, but we're supposed to believe she was so rage-filled that she shot a man? No, this doesn't sound right. And the reason why it doesn't sound right is pretty simple. That's not what happened. But it's what 3, quote, eyewitnesses said happened. And it's the story the police, the district attorney's office, and Dr. Adams's family would maintain for a very long time. There is a kernel of truth to the story I just told you. While seeing Dr. Adams for shoulder pain, Ruby did shoot him, and he did die. Afterward, she left the doctor's office, got in her car with her 2 daughters, and drove home. Once there, Ruby changed her dress. She mixed some baby formula for Loretta. She threw the murder weapon, a .38 caliber pistol, into her bamboo hedge. And then every police and Florida Highway Patrol officer in Suwannee County surrounded Ruby's home. She was arrested less than an hour after Dr. Adams' death. Florida Governor Fuller Warren ordered that Ruby not be taken to the local Suwannee County jail. Instead, he wanted her transported to the Florida State Prison, which was an odd request. Why take Ruby to a facility over 50 miles away, to a town called Rayford? You don't typically go to prison before you are convicted. The police said that this was for Ruby's own safety. After she killed Dr. Adams, a mob formed in Live Oak. And while it's true that a mob did form, it's also suspected that political higher-ups wanted Ruby at the Florida State Prison to send a message. Black women who kill important white men will pay. Because located at the Florida State Prison was the state's only electric chair. Ruby stayed at this prison until her court date the next month in September. And during that time, she told investigating officers and her defense attorneys what actually happened in Dr. Adams' office on that fateful Sunday morning. And perhaps more importantly, Ruby explained why it happened. As I mentioned before, Dr. Adams delivered Ruby's daughter Sonia. A few months later, she fell ill. She called Dr. Adams, who came to her home. He said he would fix Ruby's medical ailments, but only if she had sex with him. According to Ruby, Adams's words were, "I will get you well, provided you do as I say." At first, Ruby pretended not to understand what Adams was suggesting, but Dr. Adams was persistent, and ultimately, Ruby was sick. She needed the doctor's medicine, so she agreed. And thus began a 7-year-long affair between Ruby and Dr. Adams. If you heard the word affair just now and cringed, I understand. Affair implies consent, and the incident I have just described is rape, non-consensual in every aspect of the word. Over the next 7 years, Dr. Adams raped Ruby countless times. She reported that Adams would beat her regularly and in front of other people. He would also allegedly manipulate her with medication, injecting her with mysterious medicines to get her to do what he wanted. Ruby wrote in a letter to her attorney that she was always afraid of Dr. Adams and that he was the boss of their arrangement. Sometimes, Ruby tried to avoid Dr. Adams so that he couldn't rape her. But Adams always tracked her down and chastised her for trying to run. In Ruby's own words, she explained, "I couldn't tell him no." There is no question that Ruby was a victim of sexual assault, but Ruby has also said that she loved Dr. Adams, that he wasn't her enemy. That doesn't make Ruby and Dr. Adams' relationship less abusive. We know what coercive control is, and it's important to listen to Ruby's words, especially since so much of this case is centered on people trying to silence her. I don't want to diminish her feelings, but please bear with me on the word choices for their situation. Dr. Clifford Adams was an abuser, and Ruby was a survivor, but it is a cold, hard fact that Ruby had an emotional attachment to him, which is not at all unusual. Ask any domestic violence counselor or social worker. And there was the racial element. In some ways, Ruby felt a certain amount of pride that she was with Dr. Adams. She said, "I picked from the very top. I was married to the top Negro of Suwannee County, and Dr. Adams was the top white man. When I tie up with a man, I have influence with him. Men love me when they get to know me." Ruby believed that she was able to fall in love with Dr. Adams because her marriage with Sam was struggling. She and Sam had been on the rocks for a while when Dr. Adams appeared in her life. When Ruby was pregnant with Sonia, Sam had invited several guests to their home without her approval. And these guests were awful, rude, loud, and disrespectful. When Ruby approached Sam about the guests' behavior, he became enraged. He beat Ruby and forced her to clean up after the guests. She never forgave Sam for this, not just because he physically abused her, but because Sam had no regard for the unborn child Ruby carried. Ruby said, "Though his blows hurt me outwardly, luckily I was not injured internally and I had no miscarriage. He might have injured me and my unborn child, but he seemed not to care. Spiritually, the incident gave me a terrible fright. Always after that, I felt insecure with Sam. I no longer felt myself to be the woman of his heart, a useful tool as a wife and mother, but no longer the mistress of his inner heart. Few knew of Ruby and Sam's relationship troubles. The two didn't talk about them, but their friends did notice a few signs that the couple wasn't okay. Ruby stopped leaving the house as often. When she did go out, she wasn't as concerned about her appearance as she had been before. She stopped wearing fashionable clothes and put on a little weight. So when Dr. Adams first sexually assaulted Ruby after Sonia's birth, she was especially vulnerable, and that allowed Dr. Adams to prey on her emotionally as well as physically. A reporter wrote the following about Ruby and Adams' relationship for the Pittsburgh Courier. And now this big, handsome, aggressive man is restoring her again. She did not consider whether she wanted Dr. Adams or not. He was handing back to her a precious treasure that she had considered lost forever, her femininity. She felt warm and grateful toward him, and this man was no trash out of the streets of Live Oak. This was an important, outstanding man, and in addition, physically equipped to be desirable to many women. With 2023 eyes, we can realize that this is an inappropriately romanticized view of an abusive relationship. But we can also realize that Ruby was in an impossible situation. She had no choice but to be with Dr. Adams. Perhaps telling herself and others that she loved him felt like the one thing she could control. From 1946 onward, Ruby and Dr. Adams met often. They set up a system so they could communicate in secret. Dr. Adams would call Ruby at home. When Ruby picked up the phone, if others were around, she would say it was a wrong number and hang up. If her husband Sam answered Dr. Adams's call, he would hang up. But if Ruby was available and no one was near, she was to say the code words, "Yes, I need you. Somebody is sick." And then Dr. Adams would come to the McCollum house. After several sexual encounters, Ruby told Dr. Adams she was worried. They weren't using any birth control, but Adams said he never bothered with those things. So when Ruby became pregnant with his child, neither she nor Adams was shocked, and neither was Ruby's husband Sam. According to Sam's friends, he knew about the affair early on. No special phone call system was fooling him. Not to mention that Sam once came home and walked in his bedroom only to find Dr. Adams asleep in his bed. Ruby was in bed too. Dr. Adams tried to save face. He explained to Sam that he was there on a professional visit, but was so tired he needed to take a nap. Obviously, that was bullshit, and Sam knew it. After this, Sam went to a friend's house for a while to cool off, which is how this encounter became known. But still, Ruby and Dr. Adams continued seeing each other. There were a lot of power dynamics at play. Even though Sam was rich, he was still black. It would have been challenging for him to stop a white man from doing anything that a white man wanted to do. And as we discussed before, Dr. Adams was integral to Sam's Bolita gambling operation. Adams helped Sam pay off the cops. Without Dr. Adams, Sam's life would be much, much harder. He could go to jail, and Ruby couldn't stop the affair either. Dr. Adams was in control. In 1951, when Ruby gave birth to her fourth child, Loretta, Sam knew this was Dr. Adams's kid, not his. According to Ruby's interview with Jet magazine, Dr. Adams delivered Loretta. As Adams held the newborn girl in his arms, he told Sam, "This is my baby. I want you to treat it right and see that it gets proper care, and I don't want you bothering Ruby. Do you understand?" At that point, Sam moved into a separate bedroom from Ruby, and whenever he saw Dr. Adams or his vehicle at the house, he left. Although Sam never spoke ill of his wife, word got out pretty quickly why he wasn't spending as much time at home. Before long, all of Live Oak knew that Dr. Adams and Ruby were involved. And it was pretty clear to the townsfolk that Loretta, Ruby's light-skinned daughter, was not Sam's child. We know better about genetics now, but this was 1951. Ruby asked Dr. Adams for a birth certificate, listing him as the real father. He agreed, saying he had this birth certificate, but he withheld it from Ruby, using it as yet another way to control her and force her to have sex with him. If you're wondering about Dr. Adams' wife, Florrie, she was still in the picture. She and Dr. Adams never divorced, but the two were separated for a long period of time. That is, until Dr. Adams ran for the Florida State Senate in the summer of 1952. Then, they started showing up to events as a couple again. I imagine it was for show. People prefer to elect married men. Around this time, Dr. Adams became determined to control every aspect of Ruby's life. When Ruby didn't behave how he wanted her to, she said he would give her shots of unknown medication. He threatened to kill her with them. He tortured her by asking what kind of casket he should get her when she was dead. While the shots and other meds Dr. Adams gave Ruby didn't kill her, they did make her feel very sick. Even Sam noticed that Ruby was acting differently because of these shots. Sam told his friends that he was worried about her. So now we're back to that Sunday morning on August 3rd of 1952. Ruby went to see Dr. Adams for some shoulder pain. She paid her $9 bill. Can you imagine your supposed lover billing you for this visit? But he did. And then she and Dr. Adams began discussing a medical bill. But they weren't actually talking about a bill at all. There were several people in Dr. Adams's waiting room who could hear their conversation, so they were using coded language. Ruby and Adams were actually discussing his desire for Ruby to leave her husband and come live on his farm. Ruby was now 2 months pregnant with her second child with Clifford Adams, and he wanted to keep a closer eye on her. He said, "I'm going to get mine." You can see how that would be about a medical bill, but it wasn't. Adams was referring to Ruby and her unborn child. But she refused him. She did not want to move in with him, so he tried a different tactic, intimidation by force. He led Ruby to an operating table hidden behind a screen in the exam room. He wanted Ruby to get on the table for sex, but Ruby's shoulder still hurt, so she suggested they have sex another time. At this, Adams became furious. He yelled at Ruby and slapped her. When Ruby continued to say no, Adams told her to do as he said. He slapped her again. At this, Ruby relented. She would have sex with him. But Adams was too far gone in his anger. He continued hitting her. At this point, Ruby snapped. She said never again and started fighting Adams in earnest. Then, Clifford Adams grabbed a pistol and pointed it at Ruby. Scared for her life, she went after the gun and a struggle ensued. She wrestled the gun away from him. Official reports say she shot him 4 to 5 times. The number varies slightly. Later, Ruby reported her memory of this actual shooting was hazy. And later still, she would forget this entire visit to his office altogether due to trauma. The same day that Ruby killed Dr. Adams, she was arrested for first-degree murder and rushed to the Florida State Prison. Her handbag, which had $1,800 in cash inside, was gone, stolen by an unknown police officer or officers. Ruby's 2 little girls, 7-year-old Sonia and 1-year-old Loretta, were left to fend for themselves alone at the McCollum house. Meanwhile, a mob of angry people gathered in Live Oak. They were furious that a black woman had dared to kill a white doctor and politician. When the mob realized Ruby had already been apprehended, they targeted her husband, Sam. Sam rushed home, put the kids in the car, and drove 90 miles south to Zuber, Florida, to Ruby's 66-year-old mother's house. As Sam fled town, he grabbed $85,000 in cash, about $1 million in today's money, and only a fraction of what he actually had. The next day, on Monday, August 4th, 51-year-old Sam McCollum died of a heart attack. Sam knew that he had a bad heart for years. He was on medication for it. But some of Sam's friends wondered if Ruby's arrest was too much for him. They wondered if Sam had purposely overdosed on his heart meds. Sam's friends were not the only ones suspicious of his death. On the day he died, Sam was supposed to have returned to Live Oak. The local authorities wanted to question him. When he didn't come back, the district attorney, Keith Black, scoffed. He told the police to, quote, take a look at whatever dead N-word is supposed to be Sam, then find Sam and bring him in here. But the corpse was indeed Sam McCollum. In the Florida State Prison, Ruby became increasingly terrified. She was anxious about what this drama was going to put her family through. She prayed often. At one point, she wrote a letter to her lawyer. It explained that Dr. Adams did not have sex with her. But later, Ruby would say that wasn't true, that she had lied out of fear. One day, an unknown man came to her cell with a nurse. The nurse gave Ruby an unknown drug against her will. Then, Ruby had a miscarriage. The two events were never officially connected, and Ruby was not allowed to bring this up at trial, but it's hard not to connect the dots. After Sam's death, Ruby was truly alone in prison awaiting trial. But her family did the best they could to help on the outside. Her 19-year-old son, Sam Jr., was attending UCLA in California. He returned to Florida to help maintain the McCollum house, and Ruby's mother, Gertrude, took care of her 3 daughters, Kay, Sonia, and Loretta. Sam's brother, Buck, became in charge of Ruby's money. He paid Ruby's lawyers and then gave the rest of their savings to Sam Jr. At the same time, Live Oak was abuzz with rumors about Ruby's trial. Residents recalled that Ruby's case was both all anyone could talk about and shrouded in secrecy. After all, it didn't take a genius to realize that Dr. Adams, who worked for free all the time, wasn't hassling Ruby, a rich woman, about an overdue bill. Their affair was widely recognized, even if it wasn't openly discussed. And then there was Loretta, a light-skinned girl born of 2 dark-skinned black parents. Not that it can't happen, it happens all the time. But people will talk regardless, even in modern times, when children don't look like their parents. But this Ruby killed Adams over a bill story was what the police and the Suwannee County newspapers promoted. Headlines read, Dr. Adams murdered by Negroes. Journalists described the doctor as noble and beloved. Ruby was depicted as an angry black woman. But Live Oak knew better. Dr. Clifford Adams's funeral had the largest attendance ever recorded in Suwannee County. As a newly elected senator, Adams was already a public figure. His unexpected death shot his celebrity into the stratosphere. But at first, no Florida newspaper would cover Ruby's trial, which was strange. A politician murdered and no one was reporting on it? That's not how newspapers usually do business. But Live Oak authorities were doing their damnedest to downplay Ruby's trial. They continually asserted that there was no need for extra news coverage. The case was open and shut. Totally routine. No need to look closer. We promise. But somehow, the racist overtones of Ruby's case permeated Florida's state borders. And a Pennsylvania newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier sent a journalist almost 1,000 miles to cover Ruby's trial. And that journalist was novelist, anthropologist, and collegiate lecturer Zora Neale Hurston. You may recognize Hurston from her renowned works, such as her novel Their Eyes Were Watching God and her essay How It Feels to Be Colored Me. Here's the cliff notes on Hurston's life. She was a black woman from Florida who moved to New York in her teens. She was extremely educated, an outstanding writer, a compelling teacher, and a genius. In short, Zora Neale Hurston was a badass. Hurston said that she and other journalists were discouraged from reporting on Ruby's trial. They were told they shouldn't confuse the minds of the state and the nation by poking around Live Oak and coming up with some other loose and foolish notion, besides that Ruby had killed Adams over an unpaid bill. But the Pittsburgh Courier and Hurston knew something was off about this situation. When Hurston spoke to Live Oak's black residents, they condemned Ruby. loudly, saying she deserved to die for harming Dr. Adams. He was, quote, the best friend the Negroes in this town ever had. But Hurston saw through this play acting. After all, these were Ruby's former friends and neighbors. They liked Ruby. Hurston suspected that the black people of Live Oak feared white retribution if they supported Ruby. After all, the white supremacist culture in Live Oak was incredibly strong. Here's one example. In 1944, about 8 years prior, there was a 15-year-old black boy named Willie James Howard. Willie worked in a Live Oak dime store. One of his co-workers was a white girl. She was around the same age as Willie. He had a crush on her, so he wrote her a sweet Christmas card. It read, "I love your name, I love your voice. For a sweetheart, you are my choice." The white girl showed her father Willie's card. In response to the card, several Live Oak white men lynched Willie. They dragged him down the street at gunpoint, bound his hands and feet, and threw him in the river to drown. They forced Willie's father to watch his son die. The white men who killed Willie were never charged. But Willie's parents continued to push for justice. So in 1951, a year before Ruby's trial, Willie's parents' home was bombed by the KKK. It was Christmas. Both Willie's mother and father died. So yeah, no one in Live Oak, black or white, was going to speak up on Ruby McCollum's behalf. Because of this, Ruby's defense team had a terrible time finding people who would testify for Ruby, which was exactly what the powers that be in Live Oak wanted. These authority figures made sure that Ruby received the most prejudiced trial possible. That included the district attorney Keith Black, and goes especially for Ruby's trial judge, Hal W. Adams of Florida's Third Circuit Court. No relation to Dr. Adams. We'll call him Judge Hal to keep things clear. Judge Hal had been on the bench for 27 years. Hurston described him as a Southern good old boy. He was from the backcountry, chewed tobacco, and was pompous as hell. Before Ruby's trial began, he assured the press that this would be, quote, a fair and square trial. But it wasn't. It really, really wasn't. If being fair is a square, then Ruby's trial was a damn circle. Ruby's attorney requested a change of venue for her trial, which made sense. The Live Oak community was known for its rampant racism, and Ruby was black. Plus, there weren't that many people in Live Oak. Most of them were patients of Dr. Adams or family and friends. That should not have been shocking to Judge Hal. He himself was actually a friend of Dr. Adams. He was a pallbearer at his funeral. That alone should have required him to recuse himself for a conflict of interest. But no, they carried on with this sham. It gets worse. Keith Black, the prosecuting attorney, was Dr. Adams's best friend. Keith Black undoubtedly knew of Ruby and Dr. Adams's relationship, but Judge Hal said no, the trial would stay in Live Oak. When the time for jury selection came, it was really difficult to find jurors who hadn't worked with Dr. Adams in some capacity, just like Ruby's defense team predicted it would be. Several potential black jurors were sent away because they were friends or patients of Dr. Adams. By the end of jury selection, Ruby's jury would consist of 12 white men, some of whom were patients of or had immediate family who were patients of Dr. Adams. It's unknown why these white jurors weren't sent home, while the potential black jurors who knew Dr. Adams were. And by unknown, I mean it was obviously blatant racism. If Ruby had black people on her jury, she might not be convicted for first-degree murder. Judge Hal also made sure that black journalists had a difficult time covering Ruby's trial. He refused to designate any courtroom seating for reporters. It was first come, first served, and since the courtroom was segregated, there were only 50 seats available for black people versus the 200 seats for white people. And, as a high-profile case, Ruby's trial was jam-packed, so black reporters had to fight tooth and nail to get a seat, which was exactly what Zora Neale Hurston did each and every day of Ruby's trial. And once Hurston was able to sit, she noticed who was sitting in the white section in front of her: numerous KKK members. During the trial itself, Judge Howe continued to do his best to disenfranchise Ruby. He disbarred one of her first defense lawyers on a technicality. Apparently, the lawyer hadn't, quote, performed on a divorce case some 20 years earlier. Then Judge Howe restricted the evidence and testimony that could be allowed into Ruby's trial. Specifically, he didn't want to hear anything about Ruby and Dr. Adams's relationship or anything surrounding it. Nothing about Dr. Adams's rape, abuse, or how he forced Ruby to give birth to and raise his child Loretta. Ruby's lawyer, Frank Cannon, tried to get around these restrictions. He attempted to enter Loretta's birth certificate into trial as evidence. If it could be produced, Dr. Clifford Adams's name would be on it. Cannon even tried to submit the now 2-year-old Loretta herself as evidence into the trial. Basically, Cannon wanted to say, do you see the resemblance between Dr. Adams and this little girl? But Judge Howe denied all these motions. During the trial, Cannon tried to establish Dr. Adams's pattern of abuse against Ruby, but each and every time the prosecuting attorney, Keith Black, would object and Judge Howe would sustain. Here's what Hurston wrote in the Pittsburgh Courier about Cannon's attempt to bring up Adams's abuse. Ruby was allowed to describe how, during an extended absence of her husband, she had in her home submitted to the doctor. She was allowed to state that her youngest child was his. Yet 38 times Frank Cannon attempted to proceed from this point. 38 times he attempted to create the opportunity for Ruby to tell her whole story and thus explain what her motives were. 38 times the state objected, and 38 times Judge Adams sustained these objections. Following this exchange, Ruby's lawyer, Frank Cannon, said, "May God forgive you, Judge, for robbing a human being of life in such a fashion." As Hurston alluded to just now, Ruby's testimony about the day of the murder was the only time when any part of her relationship with Dr. Adams was allowed in the courtroom. And even Ruby's advantage in this regard was taken from her. Cannon argued that Ruby should be allowed to talk about why and how she killed Dr. Adams as a narrative, but the state objected. They wanted Ruby to tell the story through a cross-examination process. As in, prosecutor Keith Black would ask a question and Ruby would give an answer. Judge Howe agreed with the prosecution. Still, Ruby was able to share her version of events that day. She testified to the events I told you earlier. She explained that Dr. Adams raped her, beat her, and forced her to have his child. While she did talk with Adams about a $116 medical bill on the day in question, the medical bill had nothing to do with why she shot him. She killed him because he wanted to rape her, and when she said no, he attacked her. The state prosecutor did not enter the alleged $116 medical bill into evidence. In fact, Dr. Adams's secretary, Thelma Curry, had never even heard of the bill for the McCollums, which was odd since Thelma was the person who usually sent the bills. This implies that there was no bill or that Adams sent the bill himself, which brings us to an intriguing theory. Some research indicated that perhaps Dr. Adams mailed a bill to Sam McCollum, but it wasn't just a bill. There was additional information inside the envelope, information that would force Sam to leave Ruby. Then, Ruby would have to move in with Dr. Adams, just like he wanted her to. If this was true, then the night before the murder, Ruby would have opened this bill before Sam. She would have seen whatever incriminating information Adams had included and then visited him the next day to discuss it. You may wonder why Sam would be motivated to leave Ruby. He had put up with her and Dr. Adams's affair for years, but some believe that Sam was furious about Ruby's second pregnancy. He was at the end of his rope, so even though Sam had accepted the affair for years, maybe whatever Dr. Adams included in the bill could have been Sam's breaking point. To support this idea, at one point during Ruby's court proceedings, she said, "I was between two guns that morning, the gun of my husband and the gun of Dr. Adams." But Ruby didn't explain further, and this theory was never proven in court or otherwise. Perhaps the most damning part of Ruby's trial were the 3 eyewitnesses who saw her kill Dr. Adams over a medical bill. But these eyewitnesses weren't that damning. There was Carrie Daly, a partially deaf woman, Della Arnold, a blind woman, and the secretary Thelma. All three women were in the waiting room on the day Ruby shot Dr. Adams in the examination room. Ruby's attorney, Frank Cannon, showed that both Carrie and Della's testimony was largely incorrect. He said, "A deaf woman testified to what she heard, and a blind woman swore to what she saw." Thelma's testimony was the most reliable for the state. She's the one who heard pieces of Ruby and Dr. Adams' conversation. Then, the jurors left the courtroom to inspect the murder site. It just so happened that Dr. Adams' doctor's office was right across the street from the courthouse. Ruby and Judge Howell remained in the courtroom. This will be important later, but all you need to know is this. Ruby should have been offered the chance to go with the jurors to the scene of the crime, and Judge Howell should have definitely gone with the jurors. Legally, he was required to. Someone actually realized the mistake mid-trial and took the jurors back to the murder site, this time with Ruby, but Judge Howell still did not go. During closing statements, Ruby's lawyers asked the jury to do unto her as you would have done unto you under similar circumstances. They requested a second-degree murder charge. They acknowledged that yes, Ruby killed Adams, but she hadn't planned it. It was self-defense, and she certainly didn't deserve the mandatory death penalty that came along with a first-degree murder charge in 1952 Florida. The prosecution, of course, disagreed. They painted Ruby as a lying, calculating woman. She had concocted this wild love story as part of her scheme to fool jurors. Ruby wasn't Adams's mistress. She just wanted to avoid paying the $116 bill. Never mind that she had $1,800 of cash in her purse. That's the equivalent of over $20,000 in today's money. But nope, prosecuting attorney Keith Black said, "You all know that a good way to get them mad is try to collect." Them meaning black folks. On December 20th of 1952, after deliberating for 3 hours, the jury found Ruby McCollum guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death by the electric chair. After her sentencing, Ruby was asked if she had anything to say. She responded, "I do not know whether I did right or not when I killed Dr. Adams." On the whole, Hurston reported that Ruby's trial had little to do with her guilt or innocence. Instead, this was a battle of what evidence would be allowed into court by Judge Howell. Hurston wrote, "My comprehensive impression of the trial of Mrs. Ruby McCollum for the murder of Dr. C. Leroy Adams was one of a smothering blanket of silence." The court was going to prove that Ruby killed Adams over a medical bill, however bizarre and unlikely it might appear to the outside public. Anything which might tend to destroy this illusion may be done away with. Presto, it just did not exist. Citizens of Live Oak did not like how Hurston reported on Ruby's trial. Eventually, they ran her out of town, and the Pittsburgh Courier finished covering Ruby's case with a different journalist. But Hurston wasn't going to be stopped that easily. She contacted a white journalist named William Bradford Huey to investigate Ruby's case. Huey was known for covering white corruption that harmed black people. Huey tried to interview Ruby while she was incarcerated, but his requests were blocked by Judge Howell. So, he continued without Ruby. Judge Howell imprisoned Huey for contempt of court, but Huey was quickly released, and he published his book called Ruby McCollum, Woman in the Swanee Jail. It was published in 1956 and brought nationwide attention to Ruby's plight. Some Live Oak locals hated Huey's book. The local newspaper editor for Suwannee County wrote that it was false and history would forget it. But thankfully, history didn't. After Ruby was sentenced to death in December of 1952, she submitted an appeal for a new trial. While awaiting her appeal, Ruby spent 2 years in solitary confinement at Suwannee County Jail. She was not allowed to mix with other prisoners. Her meals were served in seclusion, and she could not speak to the press because Judge Howell had yet to lift her gag order. Ruby spent 2 years alone. She spent her time praying, and her mental health deteriorated rapidly. Many studies have shown that solitary confinement, particularly as long as Ruby was alone, is a form of torture. Every single day, Ruby's brother Matthew brought her breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He could see Ruby's decline. She was irritable, paranoid. She thought that Matthew was trying to poison her with the meals he brought. She made him taste test all the food before she would take a bite. And she yelled at him constantly. Matthew was worried for Ruby. She was not well. Meanwhile, Ruby's appeal went through the court system. Her lawyers presented several valid grounds. The jury had been rigged against her. They were all white men who knew Dr. Adams. The trial should have been moved to a different, less racist city. And Judge Howe restricted too much testimony and relevant evidence. He even banned key witnesses from testifying on Ruby's behalf. But none of those claims are what overturned Ruby's case. On July 20th, 1954, the Florida Supreme Court agreed to overturn Ruby's trial based on a technicality. Judge Howe should have been present at the jury's visitation of the murder site, so Ruby was granted a new trial. But her gag order was still in place. She still could not speak to the press. Before her second trial, Ruby's attorney had her examined for mental health issues. He could see that she was struggling. Cannon submitted a plea of insanity to the courts. This wasn't Ruby's first plea of insanity. She entered one before her first trial, but it was denied. But this time, the state prosecutors accepted it, and Ruby was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial. And in 1954, 45-year-old Ruby was admitted to the criminally insane ward at the Florida State Hospital in Chattahoochee. It was known as an infamous chamber of horrors. Doctors were known to rely heavily on dangerous prescription drugs and shock therapy. And Ruby McCollum stayed there for 20 years. During that time, her fortune dwindled to nothing. Leroy Adams, the doctor's widow, barraged Ruby with wrongful death lawsuits, picking away at her money until nothing was left. In an interview with Jet magazine, Ruby explained that she had no privacy in the mental institution. She spent her time praying and crocheting. Her family had mostly stopped writing to her or visiting. She missed them dearly. In 1974, Ruby's defense attorney Frank Cannon visited her. Soon after, he filed for Ruby to be released under the Baker Act of 1972. This act allowed mental patients who aren't a danger to be released. From there, Ruby went to a foster home in Silver Springs, Florida, and then a nursing home after. Author William Bradford Huey paid for everything. He also set up a trust fund for Ruby and incredibly paid her lump sums in exchange for the rights to her story. That was unheard of for Black subjects, and most white people for that matter. In 1980, journalist Al Lee interviewed Ruby for the Ocala State Banner. Ruby told Lee that she had developed Gassner syndrome. It causes amnesia and was probably triggered by trauma, drugs, and shock therapy. As a result, Ruby remembered almost nothing about killing Dr. Adams. She did remember the courtroom and trial, but not many details. Ruby said, "I don't remember what I was there for. They asked a lot of questions and there were objections and sustainings. I forgot all that." Before the trial, Ruby remembered little. She said, "I had to work all the time keeping house. I do remember we had a lot of money, but I don't know what happened to it." Ruby expressed that her deepest desire was to go back to Live Oak and clean her old home. Ruby's case is often considered cursed. Her family members often died young or had other problems. Sam Jr. followed in the footsteps of Sam Sr. He went into illegal gambling. In 1975, 45-year-old Sam Jr. was convicted in federal court. Ruby's older daughters, Kay and Sonia, lived in Ocala, Florida. They both married and were trying to become teachers. But in 1978, 37-year-old Kay died in a car accident. She was picking up Sam Jr. from prison. He had just been released. The next year, in 1979, 34-year-old Sonia died of a heart attack. Loretta passed away sometime within the last few years. She was my mother's age, so in her late 60s, still fairly young. But Ruby herself lived to the age of 82. She died of a stroke on May 23, 1992. It felt strange putting Ruby's episode out on Mother's Day when it feels just so damned bleak. But Ruby was a mother, a good mother, a loving mother who fiercely loved and protected all of her children, including the child of her rapist, and she would have bore his second child. She was forced to have an abortion or miscarriage while in prison awaiting trial, because not even 12 white men would send a pregnant woman to the electric chair, black or not. That's not the reason she went to his office that day. Officially, it was to get help for her hurt shoulder, but it could have been to plead with him about his plans to move her to his farm. But Dr. Adams saw her as chattel, as his property, and he would use her as he pleased. He had for years. For whatever reason, on that day, Ruby McCollum had had enough. Maybe it was because she was already in too much pain. Maybe she was angry because she was pregnant again. Maybe it was because she wasn't moving in with him, even if she had to kill him. It doesn't matter. She couldn't say no. But this time she did, and when he tried to force himself on her, she shot him in self-defense. I understand that today's episode may be controversial for some. You may believe she was willingly in a relationship with Adams. But how many times have I discussed coercive control? It's important to remember that Dr. Adams also controlled Ruby's husband by being the middleman in his illegal bonita business. Ruby was between the proverbial rock and hard place, intimidated by the most powerful white man in the area, fearful for her husband's business, and living in a time when the law would not protect her. She endured countless beatings and rapes from Dr. Adams. Her life became diminished. The once bright and proud Ruby McCollum was always quiet, but then she shrank into herself, weighted down by the hellish life Dr. Adams forced her to live. A life that should have been so much better for her as a black woman with money. She had a rich and successful husband, beautiful home, and adored her children. She had a life most black women at that time would envy. But not if they knew the truth. Ruby McCollum was silenced, literally and figuratively. Others would write about her and speak out, but by the time she was freed, her mind and memory were gone. She had lost everything and could not speak for herself. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by Andrea Marshbank and me, and of course, all editorial opinions are my own. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Brandon Schexnayder of Southern Gothic and Erica Kelley. Thank you to Rachel, Tracy, and Danita for suggesting Ruby's case. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website and click on the Listener Suggestion tab, or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. You'll get lost in a sea of emails if you try to send it to my main address, so this is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages. With 3 platforms to manage, that is very overwhelming for me. I hope you understand. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. I much prefer spending my social media time in our lovely group. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds, but it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say, no shit-asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe, and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on all large platforms like iHeart, Stitcher, Spotify, Spreaker, and now Amazon and Audible. You can also find me on YouTube, as well as through my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.